Hello, everyone. I'll begin by acknowledging that Green College is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Welcome to the Green College Resident Members Series. For those who are new or watching the recording, the Members Series is a weekly public lecture series in which resident members of UBC's Green College, so graduate students and postdocs, present on topics related to their research or field of study or interest. Today's speaker is Mackenzie Ashcroft. Mackenzie is an MA student in English Literature and Language at the University of British Columbia. She earned her BA Honours in English with an embedded certificate in creative writing from the University of Calgary. Mackenzie's current research, funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, examines the place of disabled bodies and voices in Victorian literature, their relationships to technology, and their representations in contemporary speculative fiction genres. So please join me in welcoming Mackenzie.
Hello. Okay. Hi everyone. As many of you know, my name is Mackenzie Ashcroft. I'm in the first year of study in my program in English Literature and Language, my master's program that is. But I've been entrenched in a lot of the ideas that I want to share with you today for some time. And before I start, there was a wonderful land acknowledgement, but I'd like to do another one, just because I feel like I'm incredibly privileged to be in this space, but this space is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And as I began a lot of the research that I'll share on at the University of Calgary, I also want to acknowledge those traditional territories on which it resides as belonging to the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nation, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Good Stoney First Nations, and of which the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta. As I speak about speculative futures and curating intersectional agency in literary studies, it's essential to recall that the lands we continue to occupy and dare to dream on were stolen, and the harm experienced by Indigenous populations through colonial violence was not a cautionary fiction, but a lived reality that requires more thoughtful reconciliatory action than simply recognition and representation. And though perhaps it's a small step, I do encourage you to read fiction by these Indigenous authors and just think more critically about your positions. So, I want to kind of start with a little brainstorming to get us in the mood of what it means to think about what we read. So, can someone offer something about their favorite book, if you're comfortable, and a reason why it's special to you, if you have a memory about it? Or do you truly see yourself in the characters? Do you like how it's written? I'll take maybe one or two examples if anyone is eager to share. Yeah. Yeah. So you kind of found like community in your family through reading the book. Does anybody else have an example? Yeah, Grace?
Stories, so like having the stories that have forward. Just like when I was Harry Potter, so it's like I know the world, like the world building aspects for it going throughout the end.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. So based on all of the enthusiasm you guys have, we can see that books are operating on us. They're offering us up escapism. They're making us feel seen when the world otherwise fails to. They build community. They build worlds. They give us courage. Books have always been a huge part in my life. I would read at night until the painted green metal of my IKEA lamp grew hot to the touch, and I would try to write my own stories in the style of my favorites. One of these was Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy, starting with The Golden Compass, which you may know. Not only did this series give me my first existential crisis at 10 years old, but it introduced me to the genre of steampunk. Its speculative Victorian world, filled with souls in animal form, arctic adventures, parallel realities, was all facilitated by the intersection of science and magic, knowledge and faith. And while I'm still reading my way through seminal works in science fiction, all your H.G. Wellses of the world, I'm interested in targeting that intersection of wonder and nostalgia in science as both a writer myself and a scholar accessing its critical potential. And I didn't realize how great of a hold this series held on me until I began writing my graduate honors thesis. Ha, big words. I gravitated towards the 19th century and the fin de siècle, which is the end of that century, and to the work of writers like Oscar Wilde and Baudelaire and Charlotte Mew and modernist poets like T.S. Eliot. Ever a fan of these neo-formalist and formalist arguments, I'm interested not only in the words, but their embodiment on the page and the phenomenological experience of reading a text, meaning what it means when you feel and think as you read. The idea that I felt I had picked arbitrarily later revealed itself to be an ever-growing fascination with our contemporary nostalgia for the past. I'm not immune to it either. I have a typewriter in my room that, honestly, if I were more of a steampunk, I probably would have written this script on it. I didn't. But paired with my interest in creative writing, my honors project ended up being this steampunk short story entitled Heirloom, and it had this critical exegesis attached that made a rather rigorous first attempt at explaining why it might be generative to approach the prosthetic limb as an art object. I wrote about a boy named Jules who was to inherit his late father's prosthetic arm, a family heirloom passed down to each son, regardless of whether they were born with a disability that would have otherwise required the prosthesis. Creating an alternative world of extreme body modification, Jules' interaction with characters like Silas, who is a black wood-legged prosthetist, a reimagined William Morris with a holographic arm, and a new woman poet named Mary Ellis, all enabled him to navigate his complex feelings about inheriting the prosthesis and realizing what it means to live with a material disability, to receive a diagnosis, instead of what it means to pretend disability for aesthetic purposes. Roughly developed, as many first attempts often are, these themes persist in my current research. And funnily enough, my partner actually had the thesis printed, spelling mistakes and all. So if anyone is actually curious, that's my little self-spawn. You can come look at it at the end. But my interest in disability and prosthetics didn't come from nowhere either. Without getting too much into the nitty-gritty, I supported my mom when she had a cancer diagnosis and through her treatment. And I myself was in an accident that led to a urgent surgery and me having to wear a dental prosthesis. But my interest in prosthetics comes from this experience and the aesthetic pressures that caused me, even now, to hesitate to disclose that experience. And so as I delve into the normative and aesthetic pressures experienced by disabled peoples in the 19th century, I'm interested in accessing these experiential resonances. So, now that you know a little bit about me, I want to lead with some questions, and likely not find many answers by the end of this presentation. Your questions always tend to outlive your answers, you know. I will then delve into some of historical literary context in the 19th century, and I'm going to conclude with a little sample literary analysis demonstrating some of my potential conclusions in action and in a steampunk text. My hope for this talk is that I not only show you a couple of cool things that have and continue to inspire my own research, but I hope you walk away learning at least one new thing. So, some of these questions then are, what does it mean to write of a prosthesis, to write as a prosthesis? How might the prosthesis be employed as an inherently interdisciplinary term that maps multiple networks of regeneration and degeneration across the demarcations of disability, class, race, gender, and sexuality? Or can the prosthesis comprise a methodology for navigating these plateaus? For non-English majors, this language probably seems a little obtuse, so I hope to break down some of it in the next sections. Now, before we delve into examples of the things I've spoken about, I want to situate you in some contemporary disability theory. As Erin illustrated in her brilliant presentation earlier in the term, there are two commonly addressed models for approaching disability. The medical model for disability is individualizing and diagnostic, and the social model is determined by normative society and questions of access. However, these categories are complicated by an evolution in disability theory termed crip theory. This was introduced in Robert McRuer's crip theory, Cultural Signs of Queerness and Disability, to say that crip theory, this is an admittedly broad definition, but it targets the influence of neoliberal capitalism on queer and disabled bodies. So to complicate this relation, scholars like Jasbir Puar, Nirmala Aravelis, and Logan Smilges begin to take issue with disability itself as a category, identifying rather the way that disability, each time it's categorized medically, socially, or politically, is continuously enfolded under and taken advantage of by neoliberal capitalistic structures. For this presentation, I draw a lot from Logan Smilges' approach in their book, Crip Negativity, which I've also brought. It's very cute. And so my original questions for this presentation and just my research in general stem from this growing impulse to approach disability from an intersectional framework, examining those frictions of access that start to emerge within the categorical intertwine of race and class and disability, as well as gender and sexuality. So there are two lines of thought originally coming from queer theory that have come to characterize disability studies in different ways. The first is the antisocial thesis. This is rhetorically articulated by Lee Edelman's book No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive. And the antisocial thesis takes a rather nihilistic approach to futurity, arguing that under the current social order of reproductive futurism, there can be no place, no future for queers, thus requesting a complete rejection of society and futurity, as there's no change except complete dissolution of an already rotten system. Reproductive futurism, then, refers to the notion that our contemporary governing norms adhere to this compulsory heterosexuality that's perpetuated for the sake of this future child. And then the opposing theory comes from the works by Jose Esteban Muñez and Alison Kafer, which argue for the creation of more futures and more options for disabled, queer, racialized peoples, more networks of support, and more dreams. Termed queer utopianism, this theory continues to oppose present social structures, but proposes a drive towards new societies on the horizon, rather than a complete rejection of the future. So when considering these theories in relation to literary studies and speculative fiction in particular, you might already be able to see how how fiction emerges as a place to not only defamiliarize one's current socio-political situation, but to envision the destruction of such a society, to imagine one rebuilt with norms flipped on their heads and perhaps is more inclusive because of it. There is strength required to imagine these alternative horizons at the same time as narratives that host these crypt dreams provide strength and potential for their readers. This optimism recalls the work of Sami Schalk in Body Minds Reimagined, who proposes a combined Black feminist disability studies framework for reading literature, such as speculative fiction, to, quote, better trance and understand the mutually constitutive nature of these categories as identities, experiences, systems of privilege and oppression, and historical constructs. So again, my research is kind of operating within this framework, particularly as I complicate the potential of speculative fiction, and here specifically steampunk, to operate as generative for authors that dream of alternative worlds and readers that escape within them. But that is also, the escapism is my professional romantic opinion. So, losing my little clicker, there we go. The last word I want to define briefly, as you'll hear it often and you've already heard it quite a bit, is prosthesis. To turn to the good old OED, the prosthesis there is defined in a physical way, as an artificial replacement of the body. And while this is true, it's also been adopted to refer to frames of extension. For example, Marshall McLuhan posits that technology is prosthetic to the human. It's extension of a sensory power and a capacity. Now, beyond referring to a physical object then, the prosthesis has also been conceived as a literary framework. Disability scholars David T. Mitchell and Sharon L. Snyder proposed the idea of the narrative prosthesis as the phenomenon in which disability is employed as a characterization device in literature. A disabled character could be incorporated into a narrative in a metaphorical or symbolic manner, such that the actual material or lived and historical experience of the disability is not foregrounded, but is rather used to address an alternative form of otherness, moral quality, or something like that. It further permits physical and cognitive difference to be re-signified. So I will address this term in the next few examples, but before, I'm going to quietly challenge you to think as we go through this about the media that you've consumed that had a disabled character in it. What role did they play? Were they the villain? Were they the hero? Just trying to think about those representations. Yeah. Many of the resources and contexts I've gathered come from this archive of the 19th century disability cultures and contexts, which was curated by a group of scholars, and I've actually linked to it with the QR code there. So if anyone's curious for now or for later, you can scan that and you'll just see a bunch of primary sources on how disability was appearing in the period. A lot of my research comes from there, and then also this text, Prosthetic Body Parts in the 19th Century Literature and Culture by Ryan Sweet, which I think is open access, which would be, if you're interested, a cool resource to check out. Now, the 19th century is often characterized by this cultural boom in science and technology. The resulting sociocultural anxieties are best reflected in the literature written during the period. Despite abolitionist movements, colonial ideologies permeated the ways in which bodies were socially, politically, and economically contextualized, from the rise of eugenic discourse in terms of disability and race, to the popularity of what we may now consider to be pseudoscientific processes of phrenology, which is that study of the shape of the skull as a means of identifying character traits and mental faculty, and then physiognomy, which is a similar study of using one's facial expressions to associate certain character traits or dispositions. Asylums additionally became places where non-normative peoples were secluded from public eye and public consciousness and were encouraged not to reproduce. Moreover, with the increase in medical technology following European conflicts such as the Napoleonic Wars and American conflicts like the Civil War, it resulted in a greater number greater number of disabled people re-entering the population and the market. People could now more consistently survive amputations, thus complicating the views of bodily wholeness perpetuated by the period's overwhelming concern for this maintenance of health. Running parallel are increases in factory and industrial accidents. As the human body of the worker is incorporated into the industrial process, the frequency of disabling injuries in the lower classes specifically begin to socially conflate disability and class, as often the prosthetic technologies, which I will show you next, were often only accessible for upper classes. The prevalence of prosthetic technology responds to the social link between visual, physical wholeness and health. This anxiety over loss of functionality and vitality became the fuel for many physiognomic arguments and prejudices towards differently abled bodies. Now, here's a couple examples, because we love visuals. But in the top left-hand corner, I think it should be left for you, is the Palmer patent leg. And as this is the first patent for a prosthetic leg in the United States. So not only here do we see like the rising ideology of the prosthetic limb as a consumer product through this example, but there's the impetus to design the prosthesis in more human-like manners. This leg is an evolution from the peg leg, yet it too is held behind a paywall, leading to a spectrum internal to prosthesis users in which those with more human-like additions, which thus permit them to better blend into normative society, offer them more normative acceptance than those working-class individuals with peg legs and hook hands. Now, Ryan Sweet also offers a reading of the prosthesis in Our Mutual Friend, which is a Charles Dickens story, and the image on the bottom right is from that. Charles Dickens' narrative is one featuring characters marked by physical difference, specifically in the character of Silas Wegg, who we see there with the peg leg. Now, he is described or characterized as equally, quote, wooden in appearance, character, and action, unquote. So, as the villain of the narrative, the peg leg is employed by Dickens as this marker for the underlying rottenness of his character. And so this, for example, would be narrative prosthesis in action, if you want to kind of complete those terms. The other aspect to prosthesis is in relation to gender. So while we see, like Sweet is telling us that false teeth were one of the prosthesis that gained an aesthetic role alongside a functional role, more in the cosmetic area of things where people maybe didn't have to, but they would replace them for those aesthetic reasons. And similarly, false hair and wigs, which we see kind of depicted on the bottom there, were introduced as these cosmetic prostheses, providing a physical addition to the body that was claimed to aesthetically enhance rather than simply supplement that which is perceived as missing. And this is, again, distinctly gendered. The increased popularity of false hair worn by women began to socially shift this accepted aesthetic standard for what a woman could look like, being that she had lots of hair. In other words, this basic level of wholeness involved the incorporation of artifice. The basic level of wholeness was already deficit. And then makeup starts to play into this similar dynamic as well. And this is a tension that I find just incredibly interesting, because the norms are not only revealed as ridiculously flexible here, but that aesthetic value holds a substantial sway on the ways in which we choose to model and enhance ourselves, like even now. And then again, as we see in the little cartoon there, comic depictions in newspapers and magazines commented on this artifice by depicting it at extreme levels across the gender binary. In this example of periodical distribution, because print culture was something that was very highly mobile during the 19th century, the widespread circulation of these grotesque and exaggerated and comic depictions actually functioned to reinforce and condition the reader in the norms of bodily wholeness and beauty that further marginalized the disabled bodies of the culture. Now, although targeted at bodies in this context, the concern for aesthetic permeated in the fin de siècle culture of England and France. Aestheticism was this earlier movement bound up in the art for art's sake trend that foregrounded the aesthetic value of things over their natural material function. Now, although artifice was prized over the natural, the artificial was expected to aspire to naturalness and sublime beauty. Now, this movement transitioned into a cultural one of decadence. Decadence is universally acknowledged by scholars in the field as a movement that utterly resists definition. It's a caveat that everybody makes. But at the same time, it refers to these formal and thematic concerns over the valuation of art. In the 19th century, it's maintained this double meaning. In a decadent society, people or culture is one that has entered into a period of irreversible decline, which is to quote Alex Murray's introduction on the subject in the text Clockwork Rhetoric. So synonymous with decline and degeneration, literature from this period and beyond connect decadence to images of luxury, indulgence, and excess. For those familiar with Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, you may recall his long passages cataloging the beautiful objects in Dorian's home, or Dorian's affinity for beauty, food, and pleasure. Now, as a blend of artistic and authorial practice, aesthetic and social disposition, Murray reminds us that decadence's literary politics, quote, all claim a fundamental link between social relations and literary form, unquote, such that the radical flux of the decadent writer's contemporary period was necessarily reflected and expressed in the content and formal experiments of their decadent literature. In other words, the style reflected the maturity of the society. Quote, if civilization had lost all spontaneity and energy of innocence, its literature could no longer rely on natural forms of expression, unquote. Yet this does not mean that the decadence is entirely dissolution and decomposition. Rather than heralding social decline, decadent literature comprises a rejection of futurity and openness to dynamic social and literary development. Quote, the decadent writer aspires not for greatness and immortality, not for the recognition of the future, but to commune with that collective of sensitive souls who can truly appreciate their eccentricity of style in the present, unquote. So this is an attitude that I find rings very similar to that of contemporary crypt scholars, who observe that society has matured without accounting for disabled peoples, and thus suspend the time of their present and allow them to exist in their negativity, in their degeneration, to find it as a generative aspect of community that hints towards a potential alternative horizon. In this sense, and others, decadence may operate as a revolutionary critique of modernity. So in that undergraduate thesis that I mentioned before, I began to theorize how a decadent treatment of disabled bodies in literature could illuminate and potentially dismantle those normative approaches to the disabled body that start to aesthetically contextualize it from a position of lack. Retaining this original interest, some of the work I'm currently doing works across that intersection of decadence and crypt theory that I described, trying to recover in foreground authors like Charlotte Mew, who is a queer female vindiciclar writer in the canon as a decadent woman writer. That's kind of where a lot of the work in the field is operating. So at the same time, decadence's historicism, I find, also becomes what makes it appealing to the culture of steampunk that starts to inherit its logic. Not only is the aesthete or the dandy marked in the essence of Oscar Wilde, a common trope recalled in contemporary steampunk fiction, but the nostalgic invocation of the 19th century as this popular setting for such literature recalls an awareness of cultural maturity. The turbulent tides of the time period become appealing places to problematize futurity by imagining an alternative past. So to provide a definition of sorts, steampunk is this subgenre of science fiction that recovers and reimagines the 19th century. Steampunk, like cyberpunk, engage with a punk rhetoric projecting countercultural, counter-institutional, and counter-corporate impulses into their work. And this is according to David Beard, who wrote an introduction to the book Clockwork Rhetoric. So by making technology visible and accessible through a turn to DIY and emphasis on exposing those inner workings of the machines, both in the sense of power and aesthetic, steampunk desires an unveiling. Now, much of steampunk's visual style, as we see a lot of here, derives from things like the design of the Nautilus, which is the illustration there, and that's the ship from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, one of those initial works of science fiction. Clockwork, brass, steam, pistons, alongside fashion from the Victorian period, make steampunk recognizable as an aesthetic. Other common archetypes in steampunk are the street urchin, the tinker or inventor, and the explorer, stemming from various works by Dickens and Wells developed in the period, but also naturally reflecting a lot of the tensions that were occurring in just the cultural microcosm. The character and their story that the steampunk creates are connected by their built environments, their occupations, their capacities. When translated into a material culture, people participate by not only consuming, but creating steampunk media and engaging in cosplay for characters that are of their own creation. I have an ongoing paper that starts to develop in those complications of what it means to perform crip agency, which I'll mention some of the ideas here, but if you're curious, I could talk about it later. So I'm also interested in the intersectional capacity of steampunk and its desire to imagine how we might wish things had been in the past into a device that exposes productive social relationships between those categories that we keep coming back to of disability, race, gender, sexuality, and class that we might inherit as a contemporary society. At the same time as speculative fiction is this space where contemporary issues and concerns are defamiliarized, metaphorized, and made extreme, with imagined consequences to cue us to the inequalities and issues of our contemporary society, society gains to learn from this literature. Particularly as much of steampunk stems from, again, 19th century literary concerns for this ever-closing division between the human and the machine, this concern for redrawing the boundaries of what it means for a body to be productive under neoliberal capitalism, what it means for a body to be normatively beautiful, what it means for a body to be global, intersectional, what it means for a body to conform to or defy norms, is what makes the genre of speculative fiction this ripe area for interrogating norms and daring to imagine beyond them. So in this next section, we'll offer a little brief closing analysis of Lev Grossman's short story, Serenov Wickham Rackham, GBE, aka Roboticus the All-Knowing. I don't imagine many people are familiar with this one. But Grossman's steampunk short story traces the life of this fictional dandy turned soldier, Serenov Wickham Rackham, as he slowly replaces each part of his injured body with a new mechanical prosthetic part, designed in brass in the exposed machinery of the steampunk style. As the story is peppered with references to real historical authors, artists, and scientists like Oscar Wilde, Alan Turing, and Andy Warhol, Wickham Rackham and his mechanical form both accelerate the scientific and aesthetic progress of the world and recall a mournful nostalgia for, quote, the elegance of his late Victorian society, unquote. The story is compelling in its direct conflation of prosthetic technology and this celebrity art, particularly when Wickham Rackham replaces his aging face for interchangeable porcelain masks. Each modification makes the next replacement of a part more necessary. The body is upkept like a machine as Wickham Rackham's soul wastes away in turn. Unable to turn to the pleasures of life as he used to, Wickham Rackham transforms into a completely prosthetic being by the story's end, having replaced, quote, his skull with a steel casing and his brain with a large light bulb, quote. The ambiguity as to whether he remains a sentient being after this procedure is provocative. Put to use in this state as a fortune-telling machine, his fortunes remain melancholy, but notably anti-futurity. So perhaps Grossman's borrowing of Oscar Wilde's quote, a mask tells us more than a face, which I think should be on the screen there, to close this narrative, it's the last line of the story, becomes what opens it to this broader intersectional categorization that's grounded in performance. What I find makes Wickham Rackham so interesting is this crypt motion to live in suspended negativity. His narrative demonstrates the dangers of overconsumption within the individual, but also, I argue more significantly, the recapacitation. Now this term, it comes from those authors I mentioned before. It comes from Jasbir Puar. So as a little side note, recapacitation is referring to this concept of how the body is repeatedly resignified to maximize its perceived value under capitalism. So we talked about that a little earlier. Recapacitation is just the term used to appeal to that. So this recapacitation then of non-normative bodies such that they become exhausted into obsolescence as society moves around them, shifting to enfold a different group into the system of production. Each time I've come back to this text, I've unearthed something new. The balance between degeneration and regeneration across the changing of times, the cultural priorities, movements, technologies. Society is not changed to let Wickham Rackham enter it. He's sensationalized. He's made a celebrity for his prosthetic attachments. But this exceptionalism does not contain within it futurity. And while Grossman's narrative does not address racial politics, he gestures towards an intersectional politics of gender, sexuality, and class. Wickham Rackham is denied a reproductive politics both at the physical level in the sense of lacking genitals, he has prosthetic legs, and due to his potential queerness, which we see as suggested in the narrative by his identity as a dandy, his links to Oscar Wilde, and the reference to his, quote, one platonic romance with Alan Turing, who Grossman's contemporary readers, meaning us, would have known because, like Alan Turing, was homosexual. So, although popular in the media, Wickham Rackham falls into near poverty. So I've put a couple of these quotes kind of depicting this part of the scene on the screen, but owing to the precipitous decline in sales of wainscoting and wainscoting accessories since the Victorian period, his family fortune had dwindled almost to nothing. He is able to survive only on his military pension and whatever he received making promotional appearances in the British Armed Forces. Twice he was caught stealing lubricants for his joints and convicted of petty larceny. He became silent and morose. He sold off 11 of his masks and the Picasso, leaving only the one entitled Melancholia. It was, he said, the only one he needed, unquote. So Wickham Rackham's prosthetic body cues the reader to both the firmness and the flippancy of social norms, where he, as this disabled lower class and likely queer cyborg of a man, is perpetually excluded from society's vision of the future, yet cannot belong to the past again either. At the level of a genre, the consumption and concerns of steampunk reinforce this resistance to futurity, at the same time as it locates this aesthetic performance, articulated here through the literary representation of the prosthesis, as this site of decadent regeneration. That's often accessed across, again, these demarcations of disability, class, gender, and sexuality. So, while this brief analysis of Grossman's story gestures to these current methods and methodologies operating across my research practice, I want to return to the idea of the prosthesis. By imbuing the prosthesis with the rhetoric of performance and the crisp realization of how materialized bodies are continuously enfolded into neoliberal structures, we can begin to position the prosthesis as a method of performance that paradoxically facilitates this unveiling. The prosthesis is decadent and punk. It is material and aesthetic. And when thinking about writing as a prosthesis, I think of the speculative writing completed by disabled queer writers of color and the ways in which they extend the pain and discomfort within their histories and presence into narratives that dare to dream of a horizon governed by their own sense of space, time, and embodiment, where care is curated. The prosthesis asks for performance to facilitate an extension across networks of disability, class, race, gender, and sexuality, but does not permit itself to be reduced to a politics of recognition. And what writers of speculative fiction can do is not only thoughtfully employ characters, as I have described in their narratives, but by writing to ensure that the speculative landscape does not become another set of norms and conditions under which marginalized identity categories are continuously generated and capitalized. In other words, we access the power of performance. Now it's thank you.